Hello and welcome to StoryDev. My name is Luke, also known as Thierry, and I am going webcamless in this video because I'd like to discuss user interface development and design, and I'd like to just purely focus on the discussions that I think needs to be done with immediate mode and retained mode user interfaces, in particular. So the reason why I want to discuss this and the reason why I've been trying to build a user interface library for quite a long time is because I've never really been happy with the user interface libraries that I use on a day by day basis, even the likes of DRMGo. And a lot of it is down to either on the retained mode side, it's got everything I could possibly want, yet doesn't have the customization options that I would potentially want. Particularly when it comes to things like Windows Forms, for example. You could, in theory, build your own components, but you're still restricted to the Windows platform, not cross-platform. You could go with something like the web in the retained world and work on, say, a web application and deploy it using Electron as an example. But again, one of the issues with that is A, you're dealing with HTML, CSS. Maybe you work with hacks, but maybe in the grand scheme of things, that's not necessarily a good thing. Mainly because Electron is known for being pretty much a resource hog, even on modern machines. Like my machine has 32 gigabytes of RAM. Even on a machine like this, it's not really ideal in the grand scheme of things to have hundreds of megabytes for an app that just does, editing, code editing. Now, you know, Visual Studio here, which we'll look at soon, takes up a huge amount of memory on the system. It's well, I mean, it's not massive right now. It's sitting at 355.6 megabytes, but even then, it's. I mean, even that's saying, oh, it's efficiency. That means, um, even then, if these two weren't in efficiency, then it would probably jump up, right? Because this is the nature of the web. Like Visual Studio Code is based on Electron, so it's kind of it takes up a lot of memory. But then you might take a look at something like immediate mode user interfaces, and a lot of developers, myself included, would probably look at that and think, "Oh, immediate mode, that's amazing." Because the reason why it's amazing is because you can just go if button uh, equals true, do something. What that means is I draw a button with some text. Let's say it's called click me. Just to type example here. I could do something click me like this, right? And then in here you do something, right? And the great thing about that is you don't really need to think. It's great for programmers. However, that said, just because it's great to build something really, really quickly doesn't necessarily mean it's giving you all of the options you want. Like, for example, customizing the actual user interface and the specifics on where things should go, right? When it comes to user interface design, you want to be able, especially if it's going to be put in front of an end user, you want it to be as visually appealing as possible. Most immediate mode user interface libraries do not do this. They give you very limited customization options, and when it if you're putting a product in front of a consumer that's going to use your software, they're going to take one look at it and they're going to think, well, this looks very, very simple. Um, and Theorem GUI and the likes are very simple. They are very, very simple. But while it's great for programmers to be able to build something very, very quickly, it's not great if you're trying to sell a product using it. So you have to do a little bit of tweaking here and there to, make it a bit more user friendly, in order to make it a bit more visually appealing. Even then, you're still limited to the functionality of the library that it gives you. So what are the differences between immediate versus, and why should we consider building a new user interface? So in immediate mode, you've got some limitations, right? So immediate mode, so pros, easy to develop, right? It's very easy to pick up and develop. It's got a very simple UI, API. It's easy to learn, which is great for developers, right? It promotes flat data hierarchies. So what I mean by that is you're trying to make sure that all of your code is kind of like data-oriented design, which is kind of what you want in the grand scheme of things. You don't want too much inheritance. That's kind of bad. And even if you do a little bit of inheritance here and there, you kind of want to limit it as much as possible. A little bit of inheritance is okay. Any more than one level of inheritance is generally a bad thing. But what are the cons for immediate mode? Well, it's not very good for large data sets. Not good for large data sets. Tried this before. I work for a company that works with extremely large data sets. You have orders that come in with huge spreadsheets, possibly spanning 20 columns, most of which are probably useless, but that's the spreadsheet that we're given from customers sometimes. And you might have, say, up to 1,000 lines, which has happened on at least one occasion. And processing all that data manually is very, very time consuming, right? So you kind of want to automate that somehow. But when it comes to trying to build something that deals with those large data sets and you need to preview it, for example, using the Dirham GUI way of doing things, or immediate mode in general, you're dealing with potentially 10,000, no. Yeah, you're dealing with like 10,000 plus or 20,000 strings of data. You're not going to draw 20,000 input text in any immediate mode API. Just not going to work, right? Obviously you wouldn't do that even if it was even retained mode, but the point is it would be significantly more inefficient in immediate mode than it would be in the retained mode. So not good for large data. Now, generally, I mean, this is from my experience, this might not necessarily be the case everywhere, because I haven't actually seen an immediate mode user interface that actually does this, but lack of customization options. So again, speaking on the part of Dirham GUI, for example, since it is technically the most established and most well-known immediate mode API out there at the moment, you've got a library that gives you a lot of components and a lot of controls, which are very, very good, and it does the job exactly as you would expect it to. But the lack of customization options, you can customize colors, you can round things, but that's basically about it. And fonts. That's basically the limits. You can't do animations. You can do, if you tweak DRM GUI, as in the internals of DRM GUI, you could animate it, but would you want to, in the grand scheme of things, considering the limitations of the library? It's not really built for animations in that respect. And the other thing also is the lack of additional customization options, like if you want to apply gradients, for example, or maybe you want to apply shadows. None of these options exist in DRM GUI as is. If you want to implement that, you'd have to go into the library and actually tweak the library yourself. Most people probably won't do this, especially considering it is massive and you kind of need to sit there and trove through tens of thousands of lines of code to understand how the library works, right? And try and work out where things are being drawn, etc. I mean, technically, DRM GUI doesn't draw anything. It actually just it compiles a list of draw commands and then sends it to your graphics engine that then does the drawing, right? But my point is DRM GUI would, you'd construct the things like the texture IDs, you'd construct the textures in DRM GUI, and then DRM GUI would send that to graphics engine. But that's besides the point. DRM GUI as is, and probably most other immediate user interface APIs lack customization options. Even with the limited amount of work that I've done on my own library up to this point, there's more customization options there, and it's not even really started yet. Now let's discuss retained mode. Please go. Pros of retained mode. Well, efficient for life, right? It is efficient for life, and let's be fair to retained mode as well. Obviously it depends on the library you're looking at, but lots of customization options. Generally speaking, there tends to be a lot of custom. Again, it depends on the library you're looking at. I'm thinking more in terms of modern user interface libraries that follow the retained mode philosophy, not necessarily older APIs, things like Qt, or I mean, technically Qt has got more customization options than maybe the likes of Windows Forms or Java Swing library, but even then, still, there is a lot of user interface libraries in the retained world that it seems good, but these are basically the pros. Efficient for large data sets, lots of, and that's pretty much it. It's very anti-developer. Let's face it, it is anti-developer. Sometimes I like to think that retained mode user interfaces were basically designed to hate on the developer, and it was really designed as a commercial gain from the outset when it was first and originally designed. Like the whole idea behind the object-oriented paradigm was to make developers' lives as hard as possible for the sole purposes of generating more jobs. Because there was a commercial, because this was designed for commercial gain, right? And the reason why that would be the case is because everybody knows how bad object-oriented programming is. The people who designed this philosophy probably knew exactly what they were doing, right? They knew that object-oriented languages would make programmers' lives very hard. They knew that from the outset. but they knew also that in the future they'd be able to make a lot of money out of it. Because by making programmers' lives harder, and the fact that you have to hire more developers to make those lives just that slightly bit easier means more money for the developers who wrote those programming languages in the first place, right? That's the idea. Maybe that's a conspiracy theory, but that's how I like to think of it. I think that, there was indeed a dogma, as I'm sure a lot of people have said in the past. Casey Muratori, Jonathan Blow, they always say it. Like Casey Muratori, especially, he actually says that object-oriented languages are basically dogmatic, and I think that was on purpose. Frankly, I think it was on purpose. Personally, a lot of people probably say it was an accident. I suspect it was designed on purpose, for the sole purpose of making developers' lives hard, and not just that commercial gain. It was kind of a necessary evil in the grand scheme of things, but long have we gone past retained mode, I think, for the most part. Now that we have a look at the number of pros in immediate mode. But like I say, this isn't a rant on retained mode. There are good things about it. Like I say, efficient for large data sets and generally has more customization options than immediate mode APIs do at the moment. But maybe that will change. More cons for retained mode. Well, all set. Hierarchies large and daunting, right? Who wants to learn about how to construct a button, construct a container to put that button in, specify the width and height of the container, specify the position of the container, specify how the button should be laid out in the container, draw text to the button, add the container to a frame or a window, and then finally draw everything, right? How daunting is that, right? It's a lot harder than just doing if button text is equal to true, right? A lot more time consuming. Again, this is why editors were born. This is why organizations make these languages as hard as possible. Developers sell their products. But anyway. So yeah, we got cons. So anti-developer variant hierarchies tend to be large and daunting. Not very easy to learn either. What was the other thing? Oh, something else. Doesn't yeah. So it copies data. So instead of sharing data, it copy of copies data. So what happens is when you construct, say, a button, for example, and you add text to the button, what happens is the button takes a copy of the text instead of actually referring to it. So if you change that text somewhere in your program, but it doesn't update in the button, you have to update the button manually. And the same is the case for any other component that you do in retained mode. Now this can be both good and bad. So Why is it a good thing? Well, what tends to happen in retained mode user interfaces, if they're done properly, is every single widget or component will have its own background buffer state, kind of like an image that is pre-drawn, and textures are generated depending on the state that it would be in when the user interacts with the component, right? That's what tends to happen in retained mode user interfaces, is it generates textures, and then when it updates the components, the textures then get replaced, right? That's generally what happens. This is why sometimes when you click on something, it doesn't feel as instant as it should be, right? Like it would be in an immediate mode user interface, because instead of drawing textures, you draw the data as is, right? In immediate mode. Retained mode generates textures, and then it draws the textures. Now, there are good things and bad things about that. The good thing is that when you're generating textures before you start actually drawing the frame, let's say, it's a lot more efficient and a lot more performant, and doesn't make the CPU have to work every single frame. This is a lot more efficient in the long term. Is it cumbersome for the developer? Yes, absolutely. 100% it is. It goes against the developer's time, and it consumes a lot of time to work in the retained world. However, because that's the way it works, that's what makes it efficient for large data sets. Exactly why. Because that's how it works in the background. It generates textures for everything. Now, you could argue essentially that by having to do all that, you have to update all of the drawing routines every single time something is interacted with. And when you're doing stuff like that, it makes it very, very difficult then to perform the updates when you need to, and actually request that something be updated when the developer interacts with your API, which actually makes life, generally speaking, harder for both developers, not just the developer using the library, but also for the developers who are building the library. It makes life harder for both of them, which is kind of ironic, really, when you think about it. But that is the good thing, is even though it does copy data into components, it is a lot more efficient for large data sets. What can we learn from this? How could we build a user interface in which we have the simplicity of immediate mode and the pros of retained mode at the same time, right? What if we could say, well, maybe we want to have choice between whether some in immediate mode context, if you like, or retained mode context. When you enter into retained mode context, what happens is you have, say, a group of components that you want to draw within that context. When you say if button, if checkbox, whatever, instead of drawing them or making draw calls, let's say, instead what it does is it draws textures that are then input into the retained mode context. And instead of rendering the draw calls as is, you render the retained mode context as it was created at the time. then that gives us a bit more flexibility on whether something should be immediate mode or retained mode. Now, you could argue the bad thing about that and the downside of that is you end up generating a bit of inconsistency in terms of user interface interaction, which could potentially be a big downside to this idea. If that ends up being the case, then that might not necessarily be a good thing in practice, but the theory exists. We could see it right. Theorize that we could have the ability to toggle immediate and retained, right? And in doing so, we have then the ability to tell the library whether something should be drawn in a back buffer or not, or drawn immediately as we're building the draw calls. But there's another thing that we need to think about, which is layouts. Should we automate layout logic, or should we not? If we're allowing the toggling between immediate mode and retained mode, then on that basis, we would have to basically allow for the ability to construct, say, containers in which all widgets, buttons, combo boxes, etc. are drawn. This might sound bad in practice, but I think it's fine. I think we can sacrifice a little bit of time for the purposes of having all of the layout logic done in retained mode fashion such that it would work between immediate and retained. What this then gives us is the ability for, regardless of whether or not a component is immediate or retained, give us the ability then to interact with the individual components depending on the layout. So as long as we've got that layout in place, the user interface or the user interaction issue that might have manifested from giving us or giving developers the ability to switch between immediate and retained is eliminated in theory. So again, we would have user-defined layout, right? So we're giving the user the ability to define the layout, and then we give our library the layout, and then we tell our library where things should be drawn, where the buttons should be drawn, where our combo boxes should be drawn, etc. This way, like I say, instead of querying the components on user interactions, we queried the layout instead. And this way, we should, like I say, in theory, eliminate any interaction issues. So this is what I'm thinking at the moment. We can go back to this at some other point, but I think I'm going to leave it here. It's almost 30 minutes, so I'm going to finish off. So in the next video, what I'd like to actually start doing then is actually begin work on programming, actually do something. So I've got this thing called TwinSpar, it's been called time. being written in so many different languages, I've obviously done some things in advance, right? Some of this is probably going to go. But some of if this other stuff like style states, for example, I'm actually quite happy with basically finding styles, component, check boxes, combo boxes, drop down menu, drop down item. This was the other thing I was going to start working on, but changed it in the end. And then defining the styles here. This is written in Odin, by the way. And then raw UI drawing and doing some kind of definitions here. We're doing interactions with widgets at the moment, but eventually we'll probably move over to layout logic. But yes, we'll do programming in the next video. So that is going to be that for the time being. Oh yes, I also managed to get the ability to draw text Unicode, basically being able to switch between Korean and English seamlessly in the same text string, right? And using different fonts there. Maybe I'll show you that or something. But anyway, that's it. That's going to be it for me. So that is that. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope to see you in the next video. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe, and see you next time.